spending, differences in spending affect happiness, and then social distance, that'll make sense when we talk about that. So what is the link between income and happiness? You could make an argument for either direction, that more income makes you happier. You could also make the argument that less income makes you happier. Somebody make the more income makes you happier argument.
Easier income makes you happier?
You guys mind if I take this? Just kidding. Sorry about that. Say it again.
I think easier income makes you happier. Like, if you make more money for doing the same work, then you're definitely going to be happier than if you make more money but you're never home. Then I don't think you're going to be happy.
Okay.
And also having more income makes you stress less about like finances and other things that you need to buy, which would make you happier too.
That's good. So the absence of stress. That's good. All right, let's go the other way. Somebody make the argument that more money makes you miserable.
Celebrities.
It's not as easy.
We're more focused on like material possessions.
Good.
Whereas if you have less money, you can focus on like the value of life.
That's good. We're gonna, yeah. That's good.
I'm going to stereotype here too and say that your kids are probably going to be spoiled brats.
Good. These are all very good, but also wrong. So this is what we call an empirical question, right? It means we can answer it with numbers and see what the facts are. But the reason I wanted to go through that exercise is, these things only look obvious in retrospect. Before you look at the numbers, you could make an argument for either way. Before we look at the numbers, let's talk about a couple different perspectives. A guy named Richard Easterlin had this idea, and he acknowledged, he said, listen, people who are richer are happier. Is this dry? Yeah, okay. So this is happiness here, and this is income here. And his argument was that wow. Can you guys see that okay? Because I can't. Anyway, his argument is that it's more or less flat, right? So his argument is you can be, if you're richer, you can be happier than your neighbor. If you're richer than your neighbor, you might be happier than your neighbor. But right. And so what he's saying is rich countries aren't happier than poor countries, but rich people within that country are happier than poor. That's the Easterlin paradox. So paradox means there's something contradictory to it. And the contradiction here is he's saying yes, within a country rich people are happier than poor people, but he's saying rich countries are not happier than poor countries. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's the Easterlin paradox. And we'll look at that. See if that's right. Man, I wish I had a pen that. Oh, here we go. I'm going to take 3 and hope that one works. So, satiation point is the idea would be about like this, which is that you, as you're at low levels, income contributes to happiness, but once you reach a certain level, it ceases to make you happier. Right? This is the idea of satiation point. So Easterlin paradox basically says, okay, if you're richer than your neighbor, you might be happy. That might make you happy. Satiation point says, well, as you become wealthy, you get happier to a certain point, at which point additional money no longer makes you happy. So those are kind of 2 different perspectives. And then we're going to look at some numbers and see who's right, if either. So the first question, or the first study, they measured gross domestic product and happiness in 155 countries. This was a really ambitious endeavor to study people from 155 different countries. 95% of the world's populations were sampled here. And so, you know, they didn't necessarily have huge numbers from each country, but this is pretty ambitious undertaking. So one kind of tricky thing is how do you ask somebody from Somalia a question about happiness that makes sense to them in the same way that it would make sense to somebody from the U.S. or the U.K. And the answer is the life satisfaction ladder. So, welcome to class.
Thank you.
So, best possible life, worst possible life, then you say where on the rung you are, right? So everybody knows what a ladder looks like, and you sort of place yourself on this, in addition to answering questions about, actually in this one they didn't ask questions about GDP, because, or all they answered was, in this study was, their life satisfaction. Then they extracted information on the country for the GDP. Does this make sense? Anyone have any questions about this before we get to the data? All right, here are the data. So each one of these represents a country, right? Somalia stands out, probably Hong Kong, Qatar, Luxembourg, Hungary. Not super easy to read, but there's a pattern here, which is what? Again, we've got happiness here, income here.
Happiness goes up as you.
Happiness goes up as income goes up, right? What's that?
Hong Kong doesn't really care.
Yeah, so not obviously there's some countries that are not, that don't fit this pattern, but what this regression line here is a summary of all the different data points.
Wait, so they didn't measure GDP when they asked people, but they compared it after?
Right, so so this GDPs are readily available, right? But what they did was they averaged where each country was on the life satisfaction, and they paired it with the country's GDP.
Okay.
So for each one of these, all they had was GDP and average life satisfaction, and they slapped it on here, and you get this kind of pattern, which is not dramatic, but it's pretty clear which direction it's going, right? Which is nations that have more money, on average, are happier. Is this what Richard Easterlin had in mind?
No.
No. So one explanation is riches make you happier. What's another way to, if you were skeptical of that claim, what's another way to interpret that? In other words, let's look at what's another way? So these countries might differ from these countries, not just in terms of
Technology.
so technology. So yeah, walk through that thought.
So like the U.S. farmers, they have air conditioning tractors with radio, and then Chinese farmers have a stick that they're working with. And so I'm just assuming the life of a farmer in America is a lot more relaxed than the life of a farmer somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay. So. Comforts, but riches and comforts are kind of hard to disentangle, right? But, so what you're saying though is it's not really riches, it's comforts, right?
Yeah.
So riches allow you to afford things that are comfortable, and so it's not really riches, it's comfort. That's
And the technology gives you more free time.
okay. Free time, that's another good one, right? So free time, that could be it.
I was going to say what's more readily available, because so it could be like modern medicine and things. Some places have it more available than others. Which doesn't necessarily make them richer always. Just
Yeah. Okay. Medicine. Yeah. Certainly. If we were to look at these countries again, developed countries have more developed systems of medicine than you're going to find in these countries.
I would say also like with this East Limit paradox, because of technology, it's a lot easier for people in one country to see like how people in another country are living. So, and that can like, a lot of times people can like compare. So if you live in a poor country, you can be like, wow, there's people living in this country that's rich, and they can compare their life. Well, maybe before technology, you couldn't do that.
Okay, so really good. So let me just back up and say another explanation is freedom. So these countries are freer in general than these countries, right? So it could be a question of freedom, right? So in other words, just based on this, we can't draw too firm a conclusion. So we're gonna look at some more data. And here this is done just strictly in the US. And what they did was they asked people about their life satisfaction, and they broke it down by income. You can see, samples are not equal, right? Only 8 people who made over $500,000 a year answered. Any guesses why that is? Downtown. Yeah, exactly. But you got no time for stupid surveys. You're rich. All right, so who do we need to hear from? Tim, interpret this.
Very dissatisfied, 32%. Once they reach about $70,000 in income, they don't necessarily, it doesn't affect their happiness after that point.
Say that again. So you're not wrong, but so if we're looking at just very dissatisfied, where do you find the bulk of people very dissatisfied?
110,000.
Yeah. So obviously, more you find more dissatisfaction at the low end of income scale than you do at the up end, right? Alexis, you got this next one.
It's the same concept. We find more dissatisfied people, or somewhat dissatisfied people, that are poor. So under 30,000.
Right on, Andrew.
Very satisfied would be 500 plus K.
What do you mean by that?
So you're going to find the people that are most satisfied with what they have going on is going to be if they make over 500,000.
Well, yeah. I mean, of the 8 people that they surveyed who made over 500,000, all of them reported that they're very satisfied, right? But the pattern here is the same, right? Which is, it's just the opposite of what we've seen here, which is just, you get, things are kind of loaded towards, on very satisfied, people are very satisfied, at these upper ends of income. And this one is kind of confusing, which is why I left it for last. It's kind of so the pattern here, what would Richard Easterlin say about this?
Makes sense.
Yeah, this is kind of one thing that he anticipated, right? Which is, or that he understood, which is people who make more money are happier in general than people who make less money inside that culture. But another thing to keep in mind is, on average, people are very happy, right? 86% very satisfied or somewhat satisfied. And most people, very few people are very dissatisfied with their lives. Very few people are even somewhat dissatisfied. But those people who are, you find a little bit more often at the lower levels of income. Questions?
Well, it just kind of seems like 2 different thoughts to me. Like, what did they ask them? Because being satisfied, I don't know how to explain it, but like, it's like, okay, are you dissatisfied with your life? Yes, but there's also things that you're going to be satisfied on. Like, I don't know how to explain it. It seems like 2 different thoughts to me.
I think that you might, yeah. No, you're actually kind of anticipating something that we're going to talk about in 6.5 minutes, which is disentangling happiness and sadness, because those are different things, and I think that's where you're going, Ben.
So, okay, along those same lines, there's so many reasons that people could have those different incomes, though. Like I look
Then
at
they have the different-
I look at less than 10,000 income, right? And it looks like people are either like really satisfied or not satisfied, which makes sense to me because it's like, okay, retired people, you're retired, you're gonna have no income, but you'll be satisfied because you're already like set up and prepared for it. So I just feel like, I don't know, I feel like there's not a lot you can really get out of that chart because there's always reasons for it.
Well, here's the thing. There's what we're talking. I mean, it's the number of reasons that people have incomes are smaller than the number of reasons that make them satisfied or dissatisfied. Right? Talking to somebody about relationships. If your relationships are poor, it doesn't matter what you're making. You're miserable, right? There's 1,000 things that contribute to your perception that life is good or life is bad, but it's impossible to talk about all of them at once. So we're just kind of narrowly looking at one thing, which is income and the relationship to satisfaction or happiness. And you know, it's easy to oversimplify, but there is a relationship there. And again, you know, the people at high ends of the income level, again, even if they're making a ton of money, if their relationships are bad, then they're not happy. And people, you know, at the lowest ends of the income, if the relationships are great, everything else is going well, they could be happy. But so while there are lots of individual differences in individual cases, the broad trends still hold, which is that on average, people who make more money are a little bit happier, which is a way to jump to the next question, which is they went to 25 countries and they did the same thing, which is individual income and happiness.
Is there, on those charts, well, and salaries just in general, is there a certain point of satisfaction where it is, you know, where it's changed of happiness? Because, you know, when we look at the charts there, it looks very, everybody likes to have more money, but is there a point where you're not satisfied,
so
and you become satisfied?
Satiation point, is that what you're talking where it's like suddenly you reach a point
what
where...
income is that? Do you have an idea generally?
It's there have been a bunch of different studies that have looked at this question, and getting a little ahead of myself, but somewhere between 50 and 65,000. This relationship is not so steep at that point that it starts to taper off. But so below 50 or 60,000. Differences in income matter a lot. Above that, it matters a little less, but I'm going to come back to that.
Okay.
So here are 25 countries, and they measured individual differences within that country in terms of income and happiness. What did they find? Cami?
You would say it was pretty good.
Pretty good on income and happiness.
Yeah.
We have the happiest rich people.
Actually, third.
Yeah, so these are our richest people, and
They're very happy.
yeah, super happy. That's something we can brag about.
What more do you need to know?
I don't know. What else?
What else?
What else you got?
Low income, low satisfaction.
Oh, that's good. That's all I wanted.
Doesn't it also compare like cultures? Like there was some countries, even though they were poor, they could still be happier than rich countries. Like Mexico's pretty close to happiness as far as the U.S., but they're not as rich.
So yeah. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is some countries that relationship is flatter. I don't know what this is. NGA.
Nigeria.
I was just about to say. You guys passed. But so the relationship is kind of is a lot flatter there. So what does that mean?
They don't care.
Income doesn't really affect their overall happiness.
Yeah. So being super rich in Nigeria, their rich people aren't as happy as our rich people, right? And their poor people probably not as well. But so anyway, the poor people are actually much happier. We actually have pretty happy poor people too, don't we?
Well, it doesn't really continue over on that side of the graph.
Huh?
Like Nigeria is on the left side of the graph and the USA is on the right.
But that's
Like-
because of what's happening.
Yeah.
Outside.
They have less money.
Okay.
So, and this is a log scale, which just means that what that does is because what it does is it allows you to compare numbers that are vastly different, and keep them, because, you know, if you were to put these all in terms of dollars, you couldn't keep this all in the same chart, right? Because U.S. incomes are really high compared to, you know, Chinese or Nigerian incomes.
So like with Nigeria, do you think the reason why their rich people and poor people are kind of seeing happiness is because of like economics or religion, things other than, like, why would that be the case? As in most countries, the rich are happier than the poor?
Yeah, I don't know anything about well, the only thing I know about Nigeria is that they have oil money and it's super corrupt. That's the only thing I know. That's probably, yeah.
Everybody's just miserable?
What's that?
Is everybody just miserable then? Is that what you're saying?
Well, there's zeros.
Well, I mean, the main kind of interesting thing about Nigeria, it seems to be that getting wealthy doesn't make you any happier. And maybe it's because, and I don't know enough to really speculate, but that won't stop me. that it might be the case that having a lot of money doesn't buy you out of the problems that it does in a lot of other countries. The U.S. having a lot of money buys you out of a lot of problems. And that's probably the case in most places, but that's probably not the case in Nigeria.
Well, some of those countries where they have corruptions, you got a lot of money, you got to pay people to keep that money, or else they'll just take your money away. So I'm not really happy.
Yeah, they do these transparency studies. Transparency International does these studies where they ask people like what does it take to do business in different countries? You know, do you have to bribe people? And Nigeria typically comes out at just the bottom. That if you want something done, you're gonna have to bribe somebody to do it. Okay, so higher income corresponds to just global evaluations of happiness. But as Haley pointed out, happiness and sadness are not mutually exclusive. You can feel really happy at the same time you feel really sad. What would be an example of feeling both happy and sad at the same time?
Your suffering grandmother dies.
Great, that's a great example, right? Did you have something else in mind?
I was gonna say, like, we've been talking about how in the United States, if you make a lot of money, but you're also really busy, and so you're satisfied with your accomplishments, but then you're also stressed because you don't have any time.
Good. So, you know, you can feel happiness without sadness and sadness without happiness, or you can feel kind of both, or very little of either. You can feel kind of numb, where you're not happy, you're not sad. So the next study broke these things out separately, and they did something a little different in this study. They asked people over time, and they aggregated. So they asked people how happy they were several times. I don't remember how many, but it was they you know, maybe it was weekly. You would answer questions about your happiness, sadness, and they aggregated them, put them together. And so, do you all understand correlation coefficients? Of course, no one's going to raise your hand and say no. Raise your hand if you do. Three. Yes, you should get a refund on your tuition. All right, so here's what we're looking at is the relationship between income and happiness. And so when it says with controls, meaning that they're controlling for all these other things, statistically, they're going to hold everything else that's contributing to happiness that they can measure, which is age, sex, marriage, education, employment, children, race, and ethnicity. So they're going to statistically take those factors out and just look at the relationship between income and sadness, or income and happiness. Cody, you look like you're eager to answer this.
Yeah, I was daydreaming.
Just about income?
Yeah, all that.
One of those 8 people that would apply.
What's that?
Being one of the 8 people that would apply. More common to
So what's the relationship between income and happiness and income and sadness? Shannon.
With happiness, there's a positive correlation. And sadness, negative.
Right. So how much, what, and what
So
about
like
this?
as income increases, you're happier, it goes in the positive direction, right? And then sadness, if you're not rich, you're sadder.
Yeah, so as income goes down, sadness goes up. What about the strength of these two relationships?
people are a lot more sad than they are happy. It looks like it's like negative 0.09, just 0.01.
So it's not quite accurate to say that people are sadder. The way to read this is that income has a stronger effect on sadness than on happiness.
Kind of like you're gonna be more mad losing money than you will be happy gaining money. It's the same sort of thing.
Right, except, so keep in mind how they did this study. They asked people several times how happy they were and how sad they were. And what they found was that lower levels of income, they were more likely to answer questions about sadness in the affirmative, right? So what is this, somebody summarize what I'm trying to get at.
Like, we were talking about the low income, so if you got a flat tire and if you make less than $10,000 and you get a flat tire, it's like you can't pay your electric bill anymore. Whereas if you're above a certain level and you get a flat tire, it'll make you a little bit sad, but it's not that big of a deal. And so I think having money, you're able to adapt to day-to-day occurrences better.
Yeah.
That would normally make you sad, but because you have extra money, you can substitute that without not having electric for a couple days.
So yeah, so the more income you have, when you separate happiness and sadness, the more income you have, the less sadness you do. So the flat tire example is a good one. If you get a flat tire and you've got the money to replace it, it's not going to devastate you, right? But if you don't, then, and as I think about this as a parent. I don't, my kids are in dance right now and they have to wear, outfits with sequins on them and stuff like that. I don't get a tremendous amount of joy out of buying the sequins and stuff like that. But if I couldn't afford it, it'd be different, right? That would affect so in other words, being able to afford sequiny dresses or whatever, what are they called? Costumes. That doesn't make me super happy, but if I weren't able to afford it, that would make me sad, right? And so that's kind of what this is hinting at. And the authors did a ton of stuff in the study to try to understand why this relationship is the way it is, including what they did was they kind of measured what people spent their time doing, and they didn't find much there. So they kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, we don't really know what's going on. But I think that explanation, the sequiny costume explanation, is probably the closest we're going to get. Unless Ben's got something. You got nothing?
No, I got nothing.
All right. So again, this is with controls, and without controls, meaning you don't statistically control for any of this stuff. And this relationship grows stronger. Just meaning that income is the relationship between income and sadness is pretty strong, right? So what have we done with the Easterlin paradox? Would we say that this is supported by data? Satiation point. So Easterlin paradox not supported by data, and how do we know that?
No data supports it.
That is hard to argue with. What specifically did we look at that suggested that the Easterlin paradox is not supported?
The correlation between income and life satisfaction.
For
People in
4 countries.
Oh, countries. Okay.
Right? Because we richer countries happier than poor countries. That conflicts with the Easterlin paradox. Satiation point we haven't really talked about a lot, which is this is the idea that again, this is the green line here, which is that you will get that it increases happiness to a point, and then you've got a straight line. And this makes a kind of the argument here is once you're out of poverty, then additional dollars don't really contribute much or anything to your happiness. That's the idea of satiation point. Let me introduce a new concept, which some of you have probably heard of before, diminished marginal utilities. Anyone heard of this before? Raise your hand if you've talked about this.
Ice cream cone. Have one ice cream cone, it's really good, but if you have 5 ice cream cones, the fifth one's not going to be nearly as good as the first one.
I prefer to think of it as the cookie
Okay.
effect.
That works too.
We had some, somebody brought some sugar cookies into the break room, and they were apple pie flavored sugar cookies, which I was a little skeptical at first, and then I ate one and I was like, you can quote me on this, holy shit. These are delicious. So I ate one really quick, and then I put 2 on a plate, took it to my office. And I was like, this isn't going to cut it either. But the secretary just saw me walk to my office with 2 cookies. So I went back to the break room, put them in my pocket. Then I went into my office and ate all of them. And then I went back and ate another. Which I think put me at 6. Which was half of the sugar cookies that were available. And so if you were to kind of break this down, you go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, roughly, right? If you were to space that out evenly, and the satisfaction you get out of the first one is, the utility you get is a lot, but each additional cookie detracts. It's not that it doesn't give you anything; it just gives you less than the cookie you got previous to it. Does that make sense?
It starts going down.
That's possible, but we're not going to acknowledge that. That sort of ruins this example. So let's say you make $25,000 a year. Does anyone make $25,000 a year?
We're in college.
What's that?
We're in college.
So if you make $25,000 a year, maybe your first job out of college sucks and this is what you're making. And then you get a surprise $10,000 bonus. What would your reaction be?
Extreme happiness.
You'd be happy?
Yes.
It's insane.
Extremely happy?
Yes.
Yeah, you'd be insane with happiness. You'd be running around hugging strangers. That level of happiness, right? Imagine you're making $250,000 a year, and you get a surprise $10,000 bonus.
Nice.
That's it, right? That's cool. It's not stranger hugging level, right? And so the relationship between income and happiness is about the same. which is it's diminished marginal utility. It's not that you reach, the satiation point argues that once you reach a certain point, no, money does not contribute to happiness. It levels off and it's flat. That's not quite right. It's close, but it's not quite right. This is the better example of the relationship between income and happiness, which is as you make more and more money, each additional dollar contributes less to your happiness than the previous dollar, right? So to understand this concept of diminished marginal utility, you just need to understand this example, which is if you get a surprise $10,000 bonus, your reaction to it depends on how much money you're making. If you're making a ton of money, you're not gonna. It will still put a smile on your face or a smirk maybe, but it's not. But when you have less money, it contributes a lot more to your happiness. Does that make sense? Here's an actual study that looked at, and this is the best graph I could find for discussing this. This is marital happiness and income, and this makes the point pretty well. Which is that if you're making $150,000, you might be a little happier than somebody making 120, right? It's almost indistinguishable, that difference. But the difference between 30 and 60, that's more substantial. And as you go up in income, that increase in happiness, it never ceases to be good to have more money. But what you get out of each dollar moves you a little bit less. Oh yeah. Let's talk about Bob Marley for a second. Wait a second. Don't read this quote, because I'm going to say it in a second.
You made a lot of money out of.
Was it Haley? Or it was Haley, right? At the beginning of class, you're like, no, who was it?
What are you talking about?
At the beginning of class,
Oh,
one
the
of
value
you
of life.
sound, yeah. You kind of sounded like Bob Marley.
You made a lot of money out of your music?
Money. I mean, how much is a lot of money to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Have you made, say, millions of dollars?
No.
Are you a rich man?
When you mean rich, what you mean?
You have a lot of possessions, a lot of money in the bank?
Possession make you rich? I don't have that type of richness. My richness is life, forever.
Okay, that was super inspiring and also kind of bullshit. It seems to me, it's always rich people who are lecturing people on how little money matters, right? But then, right? And the reason is, when you have a lot of, by the way, Bob Marley had a ton of money. He drove really nice cars. He drove a high-end Mercedes, and he had a very nice lifestyle. Smoked a lot of weed. But so I think it's easy. Well, two things. Obviously, there's more to life than making money, right? It's too simplistic to conclude that if you want to be happy, you need to make money. But I think the data on sadness is sort of important here, which is it's not that money makes you happy, but having money, especially in this country, buys you out of a lot of problems. Right? It puts you in a neighborhood that's nicer, and it buys you comforts and stuff like that. So I don't want to be too materialistic here and just say that you need to make money to be happy, but there does seem to be a relationship there, regardless of what super rich Rastafarians suggest. So we're going to call it there. That's it.